Today's guest is one of our current artists in residence, the trailblazing artist, DJ, and producer Alfred Darlington, who's also known as Daedelus. He's been active in electronic music for the last 20 years. We'll be talking about their project Unearthed, a sonic experience that immerses the listener in the SETI Institute's iconic search for technosignals. We'll discuss how they employ sound sourced from space exploration and fuse it with ambionic technology to create a listening environment that acts as a metaphor for the research that is taking place at the Allen Telescope Array. Before I introduce our guest, I would like to welcome all our viewers who are joining us from around the world on YouTube and on Facebook and on Twitch. Hello. Tell us in the comments where you're from. And if you have questions about anything that we'll be talking about, please put those in the comments and we'll get to those at the end of our chat. So now let me introduce our guest. Under the alias Daedalus, Alfred Darlington has released over 20 LPs and countless EPs and remixes. As a performer, Alfred has over 1,000 live shows on 6 continents at venues ranging from underground events like the seminal Low End Theory to festival main stages such as Coachella. They are currently an assistant professor for the Berklee College of Music in Boston as a founding faculty member for the new electronic digital instrument program. Daedalus has been at the forefront of many performance techniques, from working with early prototypical monome controllers to cutting-edge modular systems, as well as AV shows that are robotic, volumetric, and interactive. Welcome, Alfred.
Thank you so much, Bettina. I am so grateful to be here after a year largely dispelled from interaction and mostly contained on screens. Even though we are continuing that progression, the fact that we can talk out loud about forthcoming in-person possibilities is thrilling, much less the reach much further into the space. It's great.
Yes, certainly your project is really reaching into space. So tell us a little bit about what it is you do. What is electronic music? Describe the field that you're working in and your project.
Yeah. I usually describe electronic music to differentiate it from other traditional musics as being full frequency. We're looking at the full banded range of the human experience with sound, from the lowest of the lows, where it rumbles somewhere in your belly, to the highest and the highs, where it exceeds our hearing, but we can somehow still feel the air like being pushed around. And so electronic music really wants to have that expanse. And it made the most sense for me when I had the chance to work with SETI to try to also thrillingly work beyond the human senses into the ranges that typically fall outside of what we're receiving in our sensory apparatus, but very much is part of the kind of overall din and noise that the universe is creating. So not so much sound, but we're talking X-rays, cosmic rays, all these other things that essentially make the universe a very chaotic, violent, noisy place. And most of it doesn't actually occur in anything that resembles sound. But with just a little bit of soundification, we can hopefully get people to feel more aligned with our specific coordinates in the universe, let's say.
Wow, that is a really phenomenal, very expansive interpretation of what music is, right? You're really going into the experience of music, and it's even kind of scientific, looking at the entire spectrum of the wavelengths. So what is your, yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it's all vibrational. And so maybe I am taking the metaphor a little bit open-ended, but I feel like maybe that's our job as an artist, especially interpreting science, is to kind of let it be a little loose in its firmness about where it sits, and maybe just try to bring it back down to earth, so to speak, and hence the name of the project, Unearthed, in large part.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about Unearthed. What are you planning?
So it's a play on words. Unearthed is also another way of saying a search, right? You unearthed a clue or something, and so it has to do with digging it up and figuring it out. And for me, I want, as an artist in residence, to be an ambassador for what SETI presents. And so part of that is to give the less suspecting an experience that might verge on the celestial, And so I really want Unearthed to to render people's ears into antennas that give them insight into kind of both the vastness of material that we're receiving, but specifically with SETI's mission about how oftentimes it's much more about it being a narrow focus on very far away places that have taken a turn, like, eons to reach us. And so that overarching idea, kind of, then to put that into ears is a bit of a troublesome idea. But with the ambisonics that you mentioned, I think we can really give the listener a sense of place and then period. And even if that period is quite expansive, I'm not going to have somebody sit through a millennium of music, but this idea that by compressing time, we can give at least a hint at what the kind of millions of years some of the spectra is reaching us has taken.
Tell me a bit more about what ambisonic is for those
Sure.
of us who don't know.
Yeah, it's funny because in many ways we've been lying to ourselves in the typical music world for a while. We have this thing called stereo,
Mhm.
and stereo doesn't really exist in any kind of listening environment that we would place ourselves into. It's a completely artificial realm that we take a hard left and a hard right, and we kind of do some trickery, and we get it to feel like this is a simulacrum, a kind of a version of reality that we put on our ears. And then especially it's weird when we take that same simulation and we put it out into somewhere in actual kind of the space around us, and we have a left and a right speaker at these giant festivals or something, versus just having a single point of audio, which is what we're very good at doing. We're very good at triangulating single points of audio by using a left ear and a right ear. But when you start to simulate that with a left side and a right side, it gets all this problematic actual part of the sound science, because it isn't just simply that your left ear is going to get the left sound, the right ear is going to get the right sound. They all bleed with each other. So as much as stereo is like a clever approximation, it has a lot of problems. Ambisonics tries to undo some of those problems by giving an even arrangement of the phase of that stereo field, or multiple points of audio. So all that is to say, it's trying to be more clever. It's still a bit of a simulacrum. It's still kind of a falsity, but a, it's a little bit further up the uncanny valley, let's say. It's getting a little bit better.
So you really, there's a wonderful overlap between the artistic work that you're doing and technology. I mean, it's really meshed, right? And now you're adding the SETI science to it. So it's really sitting at that intersection between art science and technology.
Well, and that's the thing too, is oftentimes with the arts, we're imagining up quite a bit. We are using a language that has been honed in by however many records or songs, and we're standing on the shoulders of giants. But it does sit a little bit alone in space, and it doesn't necessarily speak to a common experience that's grounded in hard sciences. And so I'm grateful for the work that I've already, the little bit of work that I've been able to do on this project during COVID times, which has kind of put things a little bit in pause, but with the kind of input I've gotten from SETI to really understand some of the ways that these impulses from quasars, pulsars, black holes, the negation of impulses from a black hole, could have implications if we start to sonify that. But I'm not so interested in sonification as an abstract. That's usually this kind of thing where you're kind of taking a data set and creating a series of possibilities in that data set. And it's a little bit, there's still an art to it, but it's very ambiguous. I'm much more interested in just being musical, but with the hard sciences backing up that music. So there's kind of maybe a root understanding, if we are to believe in like kind of the the way that math transcends language, that kind of is a universal, that maybe that's even like in a very efficient way of speaking to alien life is through math. By underpinning the music with math, I'm hoping that it makes the music more transmitted across culture, across boundaries, and maybe sound good too. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, really universal. I like that you're taking this sort of big picture approach to your project. And talking about universal, I want to say hello to a couple of people in our audience, because we have a really global audience today. Hello to Kent in the UK. We have people coming from the Netherlands, from Denmark. Hello, Toronto, Massachusetts, Boulder, Colorado, Delhi, India, Austria, Miami, Germany, Prague, San Antonio in Texas, and Northern Ohio. And hello, Sabine, thank you for your stars. So, you know, it's really wonderful that for these SETI Lives, we also really like have this, this sort of universal and global reach that sort of meshes with your perspective on your project as well.
Hmm.
So tell me, you hinted at this a little bit. How did you get involved with the SETI Institute? Like, how did you arrive in the app program?
Yeah, of course, SETI has cast quite big shadows, and it's glorious what it's attempting to do. But I feel I didn't have any understanding how it would have reached out to an artist. I didn't know it had an art program until much more recently. And I think a large part of that is just my own ignorance and being kind of like cloistered into smaller spaces when it comes to SETI gazing so far out into space, but not realizing the kind of way it emanates and rumbles around art spaces. And so grateful. In 2018, I participated in a program with Sonar. Sonar is a festival that happens in Barcelona, Spain. It's mostly for bump in the night electronic music that might happen in a very vacuous warehouse. But it also has a daytime program that does aspire to bring in the sound arts and kind of intermesh it with some of the sciences. And indeed, at that particular festival, I participated with METI, which is kind of the beautiful stepchild, strange cousin, polar opposite. I don't know how to describe it. METI being the, rather than just listening for kind of signs of intelligence out in the stars, actually broadcasting to possible intelligences. So I participated in that project, but at the same time met people from SETI, met people from JPL and NASA, and began these conversations that really gave me an awareness of the kind of global implications of SETI's mission that has it is so much more terrestrial than I knew previously. Um, and that kind of began a conversation, and it really sparked my own interest in the ways by which I was being ignorant to intelligent life, rather than just knowing kind of wholeheartedly the cosmic possibilities of life elsewhere. It's like I felt very grounded in that, but to actually look for intelligent life is such a much more clever, much more difficult, much more challenging mission. And I just couldn't help but try to be part of that, I guess, in essence.
Yeah, well, and we're glad to have you, and it's wonderful to have um, the musical discipline as well, because the SETI Institute is very diverse. We have installation artists and spoken word and music and composition, and of course visual arts and installation. And we need all these different voices if we're going to tackle this huge question: are we alone? What's the origins of life? What is intelligence? And questions too complex to be answered by science alone. So having musicians on board who are going to think about this question or these questions from a different perspective is really valuable. So it's wonderful to see you tackle sort of this idea of how do we send a message out, and what language, is music a language, is mathematics a language, and sort of, and then also, like you said, I like when you said it's really, SETI is also very terrestrial, looking at aliens is also looking at us, and
Can I offer just a
giving people an experience. But actually, how do you see your project develop? You're really like at the beginning of your residency, there a couple of years. So I'm catching you right now, sort of at the beginning of your creative arc. But so where do you think you may be headed, and what could people who are interested in your project, what can they expect? How they can participate in that ambisonic experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things you said that really did inspire me is this fact that I wasn't as prescient to the idea that me and my own humanity would be a hint at maybe the way by which the intelligence that we'd be looking for could be mirrored. And of course, it's hard to get out of our own ego space. And very much as a musician, the idea of offering up music feels a little bit futile. There's not any other species, at least like on Earth, that seem to speak our same musical interest. They certainly display the kind of idea of sound and it's over period and what else is the definition of music, bird song and all these other things, but is it music in our way that we traditionally understand? And so it does feel a little bit furtive and strange to send music out or to even display it amongst ourselves to understand. And yet what is more human and what is more than reflecting maybe intelligence elsewhere than just being an eager set of listening ears, looking up, looking out, and wondering if maybe someone else is just, or something else, or some, that thing that we are, that random intelligence might also be as just as eager set of ears or whatever we could interpret as ears elsewhere.
Yeah.
In terms of the project, I truly want to ground people in this kind of beauty of SETI's specific array, the kind of antenna array that is being is kind of is the center of what SETI's search is currently, is such an organism. It's such a random array, right? It's randomized specifically so that it can catch just things that we wouldn't suspect, the ways that we're listening. And it's so different than us, where we tend to face the kind of speaker system. We tend to look at the mouth of the person who's speaking to us. We tend to receive very directly our audio. And I really wanted to subvert that and kind of get people to think a little bit more broadly about the listening with the whole body, the way that we kind of actually are being impacted by material constantly, but we choose to ignore certain parts of our kind of mundane existence, or maybe our extraordinary existence. Just like the background noise in the universe, there's all these other things that are extraneous that we know aren't necessarily interesting, the randomness of it, but the kind of search very famously at SETI for even, metered, maybe repetitious, possibly data of whatever form that could hint at things. So the idea that there is these kind of cosmic bodies that have repetition that are interesting in their own regard, but then also looking in between those features for just the chance possibility of something more extraordinary. So I really want to ground the listener in that. And being earlier in this journey means I'm constantly upended by hearing a new bit of science, hearing a new bit of a way that a SETI fellow, a SETI scientist might have their own insights. It gives me tremendous dynamic shifts to the project, let's say. Sometimes totally takes my project and bashes it down, and just to be reformed, hopefully in a new, more authentic, more resonant being. And that's where I think science has a lot of that, a lot of thesis that then gets like, nope, and then you have to reform and rethink. And that's a great lesson actually as a musician that I've been enjoying to really check into, because music's largely arbitrary. It's not very hard, right? Like, it's not, you don't ever really know for sure what's happening. It's just a feeling. And so to find that in the sciences, something a little harder, something more absolute, is a beautiful resonance to be on.
I mean, that's true. And I also noticed that a lot of scientists who are engaged in the arts are often musicians. And I think they are maybe attracted by that overlap between mathematics and music, sort of in a very structural, grammatical aspect. But then you also, of course, allude to, like this imaginary, the experience of music and how it makes a whole body feel. And I think I really love that as well. And we started, our chat with talking about, especially you mentioned that it's so nice to be able to maybe at one point being live again, not SETI live, as wonderful as this is, because then I know this in the live events, you feel like that bass, with your heart, and it goes into your stomach, and like this whole like vibration. And so to really sort of having a full body immersion, not just with your ears, but with the rest of you, I think it's that'll be really wonderful. And I'm looking forward to what you'll build there.
Yeah, thank you so much. And indeed, you're absolutely right. Like, to put this as an installation in a place where people can receive those ambisonics, kind of properly feel all the dimensions. They can move themselves around the stereo field or the ambisonic field and get all the different perspectives. Much like Earth toppling, it isn't just a fixed coordinate in space. It's actually toppling around our own solar system, and then indeed in our Milky Way and elsewhere. And as SETI is looked far beyond just the confines of our neighborhood, right? We're just in our own little tide pool. We have a vast ocean of experience that's going on that we are getting these tiny, tiny fragments of. And I really want the listener to be able to move around, potentially like a pinball, like just like kind of get all those different moments, even in their conciseness and also their kind of messiness, and get some insight in that regard. So it's very likely to be an installation in a few locations, and then a binaural experience, which is kind of like a paring down of the ambisonics, but to a place where it's a little bit better than stereo again. It gives you a little up, down, left, right, through, transversing. And so that'll be an experience hopefully that everyone can achieve and get some insight from as well.
Wonderful. And I know that you've already started talking some of our SETI scientists, and I think you've been in conversation with our wonderful senior scientist, Seth Shostak. So what insights have you gained from the scientists? What have you been chatting about?
Well, the most direct communication was some of their insight into if you were to render auditory some of the actual space phenomena, some things actually do transmit audio on their own, but the vast majority of them are either bursts of long extended distended white noise, which is essentially all frequencies,
Mm.
all of our perceived frequencies. So it's just very kind of brutal, you could say, or just this kind of like what sounds like the surf, right? The sound of like the unending ocean. And then other things like FRBs or indeed pulsars, you have these like direct periods that even do sometimes line up on the auditory range where they might sound like a blip or a burst or a little glissando. So these are like these direct analogies that you can find music in. And of course, then the metaphor for those same ideas can be you can find all kinds of music metaphors in terms of like rhythm or period that creates, either if it's fast enough it would be creating an auditory frequency, or if it's slow enough it just sounds like rhythms that might be intertwined, odd meters that then can make syncopations and interesting kind of feelings that would have analogies throughout the auditory world of kind of dance music or many cultural music. So there's all these different places that Seth pointed out very nicely could find. But one of the things that I found most inspiring was Seth gave me some of their own personal insight into being at the bottom of a valley with a radio telescope, listening out and both feeling the enormity of the universe, but also feeling very connected to, here is the system that in many, many, many millions, billions of years will end, will cease. And that secession in some ways is so necessary for the arts, but not necessarily always conceived of in the sciences. You don't always think of the beginning and the end of something. You're just
Yeah.
dealing with the moment of it. But with music, you have to have an end to realize like the actual piece. There has to be a beginning and an end. And so I'm kind of taking to heart what they were saying as being a place where this music doesn't have to go on forever. It doesn't have to be something that is generated and just happening. It can actually have a succession that makes sense for the science. And I'm grateful for that gift, even if it's a terrifying prospect in some regards. But we'll all be long, long gone before that happens. But
Yeah,
still,
it's amazing that you think of that scales, and that sort of echoes the SETI search, right? I mean, it makes us think about different scales of time and space. So
yeah.
I want to move into audience questions, which have started to trickle in. But before we get to that, I would like to take this opportunity to remind you that the SETI Institute is a nonprofit organization, and it's due to contributions from viewers like you that these SETI Live events are possible. So if you'd like to support us, please consider giving to us, and you can go to seti.org and hit donate, and we would really appreciate it. Thank you so much. So let's get to some questions. So we have a question here. What are your thoughts about possibly cosmic dance being a form to communicate, such as the traditional dances of Tamil Nadu in the southern part of India, called, and now I'm going to try to pronounce this, Bharatan Atayam. No, I got this wrong. I apologize. I shouldn't have tried. But but the idea of connecting dance with music, since there's already this sort of immersive environment going on, you're feeling things with your body. I think that was a nice segue there.
I think in many ways you could think of dance often as the Rosetta Stone of sound, where dance renders understanding from what is sometimes disparate rhythm or melody, especially in the cultural context. And so, in some regards, if we just beamed music out into space with no other no other reaction, let's say, it floats much more. It remains to be just a series of maths, maybe a series like someone who doesn't know what music like actually resonates in the body might just think of it as being okay. They're sending us these overtones and these undertones and these frequency modulations. What's the language in that? What's the meaning, rather than the emotional outpour or the connectivity that dance renders? So maybe in some ways the most effective thing we can do is to indeed embody and entrain this music in the most human way possible, which is in the constraints of our given system, and indeed also with our breath, which is so much part of our terrestrial experience. And I think that would give so much more insight into an alien if they could perceive the sound or the visual that we would be presenting And of course, dance does require also a facing, which I love, again, the coordinate aspect of, if we're talking about the coordinates of ourselves in the universe, dance is a great way of kind of really highlighting, well, this is our gravity, this is our reality, this is our surroundings. It kind
Yeah,
of, to a clever viewer, they would be getting all this extra information that would really then make the music make sense, make the dance make sense, and maybe our humanity in addition to that.
yeah. Imagine doing these sort of wonderful sacred dances in a different gravity, right?
Mhm.
What would happen there? Wow. Great question. Thank you for
Mhm.
that. Another
Yeah.
question that came in is a bit more technical. So, what software or other electronic devices are you using to create the ambisonic experience?
Yeah. Um, there's a few different competing programs that are currently on the market. The one I'm most curious about, and this is for, again, those who are technically enabled out there, I'm looking at Envelope. It's a startup out of San Francisco. They both are very detailed with ambisonics in terms of the physical location, but they do have a plugin that they've been working towards that works with vast majority of DAWs, of digital audio workstations. I particularly like Ableton's Live, and Ableton has just recently begun to be more have multi output, um, to be a little bit more potential in that regard. I'm also looking at Bitwig as being another solution. Bitwig is just another new kid on the block, so to speak, that does that does surround sound very well. Um, that being said, by the time this program, I mean, by the time this like project comes to fruition, there may be new interesting possibilities, and I have to kind of keep checking in what's out there because the field is evolving so fast, much just like our own understanding of the universe. It just sometimes just leaps and bounds, and you just have to be supple enough to receive that. So, thus far, Envelope is the most interesting one to me, but I'm definitely keeping ears out for other possibilities.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, in your field, you have to be so on top of what is happening. And I guess that also sort of influences how you make music and how it sounds and the possibilities of your creative expression.
Although I will say though, and this is where things get a little bit strange, is that oftentimes with music, people get stuck in epochs. They get stuck on composers, or they get stuck in periods. Just like if I said to you jazz, some people might think Kenny G, other people might think Jelly Roll Morton, and neither person will be wrong, even though they'd be vastly different sounds. And I think electronic music suffers from some of that same thing. If I said electronic music to someone who is in Berlin and listens to techno, well, that whole world comes down to a very narrow range of BPMs versus somebody who just deals with electroacoustic modular performance or something. And then all the blips and bleeps become the center of their universe. So it's kind of fun to play with expectations, but equally, we have to develop a language that's expansive enough to maybe include whatever we're going to encounter. So
Right.
that's
Actually, on along those lines, I have another question coming in that that's asked: does music mean anything if there's no air and no entering ear? So what if, what if the aliens who are receiving the signals don't have an atmosphere? What do you imagine happening there?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because we have this kind of concept that sound is necessitated by the movement of air. And in many definitions, that's the case. And yet the emotions that we attach to it communicate across a broad sensory apparatus that is also transmitting as well as receiving. I love the fact that when we're blushing or we get that kind of goose flesh or goosebumps, that's a very visual or like physical touch reaction to a sound phenomena. And part of that is we're synesthetic creatures that we are constantly rendering our world around us audio or visual, even when it's coming from different stimuli. So kind of the same way, I would imagine in space, they may not interpret sound in any kind of regard that we would do, right? It isn't happening in the vacuum of space. And yet we are looking out into the stars. We're receiving radio information, X-ray, all this other spectra, and we're at times giving it the characteristics of audio in terms of period, frequency. And so why does this have to be disparate? It's a much more minute, much narrower range that we consider audio. But if we were to expand that definition, it could easily be that we're transmitting out in radio, X-ray, you could say very much more upper order harmonics to the point where they're in the kind of energy transmission of heat or something else. But it's all in the continuum. It's all possible. So indeed, the music we might be receiving from the spheres quite literally might just be outside of our own auditory range, or it might even be so low and to be in the gravitational range. Wouldn't it be interesting if some of these gravity waves that we've been interpreting are just very slow musics from elsewhere? It's possible.
I love the way you're thinking of, expanding the spectrum maybe into the, X-ray and infrared. That is so cool. I have like we get creeping up to sort of the end of our time together. I want to squeeze in one question. Should we make an interstellar radio station for Earth, playing the cutting edge understanding of our music all the time?
Yeah. It is kind of sad to think that Voyager, right, or the golden record is this testament to our audio nature. And of course it's a remarkable achievement, and it's somewhere bounding around around the stars. But it is in many ways not the totality of humanity's musical offering, let's say. And there's certainly lots of aberrant radio that has been ejected into space ever since, for the past 120 odd years or whatever it's been now that radio has been part of our existence. And that's somewhere echoing around the stars. But it's such a jumble that the idea of a concentrated kind of offering energetically would take a huge amount, just like receiving a lot of this transmissions that SETI is getting through the antenna and elsewhere, other antennas. It takes a massive amount of detailed both study and energy. Equally, projecting that matter into space takes a lot of energy. Just talk to Mehdi again about how much it takes to get tiny fragments of audio. It's a huge undertaking. I would love it if it was a concentrated idea that not only are kind of the hard power of the world's offering when we're kind of studying space for the resources that we can grab and take, and kind of our nearest neighbors, how it's all being like kind of plotted away along these kind of country lines. If we could start to really think of our soft power, let's say, of our humanity, being also put into space in a very meaningful way, and really plotting its next steps, not just where we can set down and terraform Mars or something such, but where we can really think about the way that we can expand our kind of awareness and our culture to include the possibility of transhumanity, right? Like the elsewhereness that we will soon enough be undertaking, but with very little regard towards what it sounds like, or what the arts might do, and indeed other gravity or whatnot. So hopefully we'll have to encounter that, because as we transmit ourselves elsewhere, we will be taking part of our artistic selves inevitably.
Yeah, culture is part of who we are, and so obviously that'll travel with us. I think this is a beautiful place to sort of wind it down. Before we end, I think it would be nice if we could share in the comment section, for those who are interested, maybe links to projects that you've already done that sort of relate to astronomy and the SETI search, because you didn't just parachute into this sort of field of interest, like suddenly, like, hey, SETI, and like, there's Alfred. You've actually been sort of on this journey for a while. So you'd want to just mention a couple of things that you've already been involved with in that kind of vein. So when people don't want to wait, so long till the Unearthed project is done, in the meantime, maybe they can check out some of your projects.
I appreciate that so much. Yeah, indeed, the much mentioned Mehdi being this an undertaking that was along with Sonar Calling. I believe we can share a link for that, and that's a number of artists. I think 28 artists total, maybe it's 32 now, where we all beamed messages into space, and some of the songs are available, and they're quite ridiculous and short. Again, it's quite an undertaking to send that into outer space. So my song's like 8 seconds, and it's terribly low bit rate, but it's a thing, and it's kind of playing in these themes. And then also in 2014, I was part of a group called Adventure Time, which predates the cartoon. It predates some of these other ideas. We were an association for a long time, but we were really reacting to this idea of the interpretations of outer space through old records, kind of plunderphonic ideas. And we did assemblage and collage of music to create this. And so there's maybe a music video that we can offer up in the comments that is kind of our interpretation of pre-interstellar activity. And that, yeah, a lot of curiosity in addition to those things. And a lot of the other records have moments of astral traveling, let's say, in the Sun Ra sense, but never anything as manifest as this. So I'm so grateful to be able to ride with all y'all in this kind of endeavor.
I'm so glad that you're part of our program. And for anyone interested, if you go to the SETI.org website /AIR, IR for artists in residence, Daedalus has his own portfolio page there and links to previous album covers and his website. If you want to explore some more, I encourage you to do so. And I want to thank you, Alfred, for taking this time. It was really wonderful to sort of climb into your head and walk around. And thank you for explaining to us what electronic music is and the wonderful project that you're working on. And once you're further along, we'll have you in again, and maybe then we can listen in what you're working on. It won't be the full body experience, but we'll give you a little sneak peek. So thank you, and thank you for everyone who is joining us today for the SETI Live, and we will see